My boss told me to change my name on emails because clients might find it hard to trust. The HR director's voice was steady when she told me they'd found the recording. Mr. Mehta, we need you to understand that what we're about to discuss changes everything. Jennifer Lawson had 17 years in corporate human resources, specializing in discrimination cases for Fortune 500 companies before joining Stratford Solutions 3 years ago. She sat across from me in the conference room with a digital recorder on the table between us and a legal pad covered in notes I couldn't read from my angle. My hands were shaking. They'd been shaking since I'd pressed send on that email to the compliance hotline 6 days earlier, since I'd attached the audio file I'd been recording on my phone for the past 3 months. Every conversation with my boss, David Whitmore. Every meeting where he suggested I might want to consider softening my image for client relations. Every performance review where he praised my work but questioned whether I had the cultural fit for advancement. I'd been working at Stratford Solutions for 4 years when David was promoted to Senior Vice President of Client Services and became my direct supervisor. Before that, I reported to Linda Garrison, who'd hired me straight out of graduate school at MIT. Linda was methodical, fair, believed in data over optics. Under her leadership, I'd brought in 6 major accounts, redesigned our entire client onboarding system, and won the company's Innovation Award 2 years running. My performance reviews were flawless. My salary increased steadily. I was on track for director level by 30, which felt earned after spending 20-hour days building solutions that saved our clients millions. Then Linda took a position at Microsoft in Seattle, and David Whitmore stepped into her role. The first time we met one-on-one, he looked at my name placard on my desk and said, "Arjun, that's quite a mouthful. Have you ever thought about going by something simpler, like AJ?" I laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. Within a month of David taking over, subtle changes started appearing in how he managed me versus my colleagues. During team meetings, he'd interrupt me mid-presentation to ask clarifying questions he never asked others. When I'd email clients directly, he'd CC himself and send follow-up messages just to make sure we're all aligned on messaging. He started scheduling my client calls during his availability so he could join, which he explained as mentorship, but felt like supervision. The other account managers didn't get this treatment. Kelsey Williams, who'd been with the company 2 years less than me, was given full autonomy on her accounts. Patrick Sullivan, who'd joined 6 months after David's promotion, was already leading strategy meetings independently. When I asked David why he felt the need to oversee my client interactions so closely, he said it was because I was being groomed for bigger things and needed to learn executive presence. That sounded reasonable until I realized none of my evaluations mentioned lacking executive presence. None of my clients had complained about my communication. The feedback was always the same: thorough, responsive, brilliant at problem solving. The email incident happened on a Wednesday in March. I'd been corresponding with a potential client, Northridge Industries, about a comprehensive security audit they needed for their manufacturing operations. The CEO, Robert Kelly, had specifically requested me after seeing a presentation I'd given at an industry conference. We'd exchanged probably 15 emails over 2 weeks, building rapport, discussing their specific vulnerabilities, outlining a proposal that would require board approval, but that Robert seemed genuinely excited about. The contract was worth $1.3 million, which would make it my largest individual account acquisition. I was drafting the final proposal when David called me into his office. He closed the door, which he rarely did, and sat on the edge of his desk rather than behind it, which I'd learned meant he wanted the conversation to feel casual, even though it wasn't. "I've been reviewing your correspondence with Northridge," he said, pulling up the email thread on his laptop and turning the screen toward me. "Your technical knowledge is solid, really impressive work, but I'm concerned about the tone." I scanned the emails, looking for whatever had triggered his concern. They were professional, detailed, appropriately formal for a business relationship being established. I'd used proper grammar, avoided jargon except where necessary, provided clear explanations of complex concepts. "What specifically feels off about the tone?" I asked. David leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest in a posture that I recognized from watching him negotiate with vendors. Defensive, but trying to appear reasonable. "It's not off exactly, it's just... Arjun, you have to understand that guys like Robert Kelly are old school. They're used to working with people who look and sound a certain way. When they see a name like yours in their inbox, they make assumptions. Not fair assumptions, but assumptions nonetheless." My stomach dropped. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker. "You're saying he has a problem with my name?" David raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm not saying he does. I'm saying he might. And in sales, we have to be strategic about eliminating any possible friction points. What I'm suggesting is that for your email signature and any client-facing communications, you might consider using a more accessible version of your name." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline that never came. "You want me to change my name?" David sighed like I was being intentionally difficult. "I want you to optimize for success. Look, I had a buddy in consulting who went by his middle name professionally because his first name was difficult for people to pronounce, made his life easier, made clients more comfortable, removed a barrier that had nothing to do with his abilities. This isn't about you changing who you are. It's about strategic positioning. The academic part of my brain, the part that had studied organizational behavior and corporate structures, recognized this as textbook discrimination dressed up in the language of practical business advice. The human part of me wanted to believe David didn't understand how deeply insulting this suggestion was, that he genuinely thought he was helping. My name is Arjun Mehta. It's been my name my entire life. It's on my business cards, my email signature, the company directory. Clients who've worked with me for years know me as Arjun. Changing it now would be confusing and dishonest. David's expression hardened slightly. I'm not asking you to legally change your name. I'm asking you to think about your career trajectory here. You're talented, no one's disputing that. But talent only gets you so far. Politics matter, optics matter. Being willing to adapt matters. I left that meeting without agreeing to anything, my heart pounding against my ribs like it was trying to escape my chest. I sat at my desk and stared at my computer screen, at the email draft to Robert Kelly, at my signature that read, Arjun Mehta, Senior Account Manager, Stratford Solutions. 29 years old. Master's degree from one of the best engineering programs in the country. 4 years of documented excellence in this role. And my boss was telling me my name was a liability. I closed my laptop and went home early, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely a lie. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation, analyzing David's word choices, trying to determine if I was overreacting. Maybe he really did have a friend who changed his name professionally. Maybe this was standard advice in corporate America, and I'd just been naive enough not to encounter it before. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Not explosive anger, but cold, calculated fury at the realization that despite everything I'd achieved, someone was asking me to make myself smaller to make others comfortable. The next morning, I sent David an email declining his suggestion. I kept it professional, explained that I'd built my professional reputation under my legal name, and believed changing it would undermine client trust rather than build it. I copied myself on the email, saving it to a personal folder. David responded within an hour. Understood. Your choice, of course. Let's discuss at our next one-on-one. That one-on-one, scheduled for the following Monday, started normally enough. David reviewed my quarterly numbers, which exceeded targets by 18%. He complimented a presentation I'd delivered to the executive team. Then his tone shifted. I've been thinking about the Northridge account. Given the strategic importance and the relationship dynamics involved, I think it might be better if Patrick takes lead on this one. You can support him, obviously. Your technical knowledge is invaluable. But Patrick has more experience building rapport with this particular client demographic. The words felt like physical blows. Patrick Sullivan had been with the company less than 2 years. He'd never closed an account over $500,000. He'd never even met Robert Kelly. This was punishment. Retribution for not complying with the name change suggestion. Robert specifically requested to work with me, I said, keeping my voice level despite the rage building behind my teeth. He came to us because of my conference presentation. Reassigning this account makes no business sense. David smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Business isn't always about what makes logical sense, Arjun. It's about relationships and trust. Patrick went to Dartmouth. Robert went to Dartmouth. They're both members of the university club. These connections matter in high-value sales. I know that's not fair, but it's reality. You'll still get credit for originating the account. Your commission structure won't change, but Patrick will be the primary relationship manager. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the desk. Instead, I nodded, said I understood, and walked back to my workstation feeling like I'd been physically assaulted. Kelsey caught my expression and mouthed, "You okay?" from across the divider. I shook my head and kept walking to the bathroom, where I locked myself in a stall and pressed my fists against my eyes until the urge to cry passed. 3 days later, I started recording every conversation I had with David. Massachusetts is a 2-party consent state for recording, which meant I couldn't use the recordings in court without informing him first. But I could use them to document patterns, to have proof of what was being said to me when no one else was listening. Over the next 3 months, I collected evidence. David suggesting in a closed-door meeting that I might want to tone down the ethnic food I brought for lunch because it lingers in the break room. David explaining that he couldn't put me forward for the VP of Innovation role because the position required someone who could represent the company at country club events and investor dinners. David critiquing my wardrobe choices, saying that while my suits were perfectly professional, I might consider less bold colors for client presentations. Each conversation was recorded. Each instance was documented with dates, times, witnesses when available. I created a spreadsheet tracking my performance metrics against my peers, showing that my numbers consistently exceeded theirs while my advancement opportunities consistently lagged. I saved every email where David praised my technical abilities but questioned my cultural fit. I documented every account reassignment, every meeting I was excluded from, every promotion I was passed over for, despite meeting every stated qualification. The breaking point came in June when David announced the new director-level position I'd been working toward for 3 years was being filled by an external hire. Someone from David's previous company. Someone who'd never worked in our specific industry before. Someone named Brent Ashford who wore Vineyard Vines ties and used the word synergy, unironically. The announcement came via email to the entire department on a Thursday afternoon. Pleased to welcome Brent Ashford to the Stratford Solutions family as Director of Strategic Accounts. Brent brings 15 years of client services excellence and will be leading our expansion into the Northeast manufacturing sector. The Northeast manufacturing sector was my specialty. I'd written 3 white papers on it. I'd spoken at conferences about it. I'd personally brought in 8 of our 10 largest manufacturing clients. This position should have been mine based on merit alone, but that clearly wasn't the criteria being used. I forwarded the announcement to my personal email, added it to my evidence folder, and started researching employment discrimination attorneys. That same evening, I called my father. He'd immigrated from India in the late 80s, had spent 40 years working his way up from junior engineer to director level at an aerospace company in California. When I told him what was happening, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I changed my name when I first started working. Went by Art instead of Arjun. Thought it would make things easier. It didn't. They found other reasons to keep me at arm's length. The name wasn't the problem. My face was. My accent was. Where I came from was. Took me 15 years to understand that making myself smaller doesn't make racists more comfortable. It just makes you smaller." I'd never known my father had changed his name professionally. He'd always been Arjun on everything I'd seen, all my childhood. Learning that he'd tried to accommodate the same discrimination I was facing now made me furious on his behalf and determined not to repeat his mistake. I'd already made myself smaller by documenting instead of confronting, by playing David's game instead of calling it out publicly. The next morning, I scheduled a meeting with Jennifer Lawson in HR, requesting it as a confidential matter requiring legal discretion. Jennifer's office was on the executive floor, decorated with diplomas from Georgetown Law and certifications from various employment law organizations. She was in her mid-50s, with silver hair she wore pulled back severely and a reputation for being absolutely unflinching in discrimination cases. When I sat down across from her and said, "I need to report a pattern of discrimination by my direct supervisor," her expression didn't change. She pulled out a legal pad, clicked her pen, and said, "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning." I talked for 90 minutes. I showed her the spreadsheet of comparative performance metrics. I played selected portions of the recordings, the ones that were most clearly problematic. I showed her the email thread where David suggested I change my name, the account reassignments, the promotion denials, the constant micromanagement I experienced while my white colleagues operated with complete autonomy. Jennifer took notes throughout, stopping me occasionally to ask clarifying questions or request specific dates. When I finished, she was quiet for maybe 30 seconds, her pen hovering over the legal pad. Then she said, "Mr. Mehta, what you've described constitutes a clear pattern of national origin discrimination and potentially hostile work environment. The recordings complicate matters legally since you didn't inform Mr. Whitmore he was being recorded, but they can still be valuable as your personal documentation of conversations. More importantly, the email evidence and the performance metric comparisons are legally admissible and paint a very clear picture. I need to launch a formal investigation, which will require interviewing Mr. Whitmore and other members of your team. Are you prepared for that?" I nodded. "I'm prepared. But I want protection from retaliation. David already took the Northridge account from me and blocked my promotion. I can't afford to lose my job while this investigation is happening." Jennifer made a note. "Massachusetts law prohibits retaliation against employees who file discrimination complaints. We'll document this meeting. I'll send you a confirmation email for your records, and any adverse employment action against you from this point forward will be scrutinized heavily. However, I need to be honest with you about what this process looks like. Investigations take time, usually 4 to 6 weeks minimum. During that time, you'll still report to Mr. Whitmore unless we determine immediate separation is necessary. This will be uncomfortable." Uncomfortable turned out to be a spectacular understatement. The day after my meeting with Jennifer, David's demeanor toward me changed noticeably. He didn't say anything directly, but his body language was hostile. He stopped scheduling one-on-ones with me. He started communicating through terse emails rather than conversations. When we had to interact in team meetings, he'd look just past me rather than making eye contact. I didn't know if Jennifer had already approached him or if he somehow sensed something had shifted, but the tension was palpable. My colleagues noticed too. Kelsey pulled me aside after a particularly awkward team meeting and asked if everything was okay. I wanted to tell her what was happening, but I'd signed a confidentiality agreement with HR as part of the investigation process. All I could say was that things were being handled through proper channels, and I appreciated her concern. Patrick, interestingly, started being friendlier to me. Overly friendly, in a way that felt performative. He'd stop by my desk to chat about nothing in particular, ask if I wanted to grab lunch, compliment my work in team meetings. It took me 3 days to realize he was probably worried I'd mentioned his name in my complaint, which I had, but only as evidence of disparate treatment, not as an accusation of wrongdoing on his part. The investigation progressed slowly and methodically. Jennifer interviewed 12 people over 4 weeks. Every member of our team, our previous supervisor Linda, who she contacted at Microsoft, several clients I'd worked with, and David himself. I wasn't privy to those conversations, but I could track their impact by watching David's increasingly erratic behavior. He started working from home more frequently. He missed 2 team meetings with vague excuses about client emergencies. His assistant mentioned he'd been on the phone with legal department multiple times. Meanwhile, I kept my head down and continued doing my job at the same high level I'd always maintained, knowing that any dip in performance could be used against me. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Kelsey apparently disclosed during her interview that David had made similar comments to her about her appearance affecting her advancement opportunities. She was Indian American, third generation, with an accent indistinguishable from any other Boston native. But David had still found ways to other her, suggesting she might not have the traditional background clients expected for director-level relationship management. She'd been documenting incidents too, independently, not knowing I was doing the same thing. When Jennifer connected our two separate complaint threads, the pattern became undeniable. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. The day Jennifer called me back to her office, I knew something had shifted. She had another person with her this time, a man she introduced as Michael Sterling, external employment counsel retained by Stratford Solutions for discrimination cases. Michael was probably 60, with a weathered face that suggested he'd been in litigation trenches for decades. He shook my hand firmly and said, "Mr. Mehta, I've reviewed the investigation findings and I need to be direct with you. This company has significant exposure here. The evidence is extensive, corroborated by multiple sources, and the pattern of discriminatory behavior is clear. My recommendation to the executive team is immediate termination of David Whitmore and implementation of comprehensive anti-discrimination training across all management levels." I felt my knees go weak. I'd hoped the investigation would result in some kind of consequence for David, but hearing termination spoken aloud made it real in a way that simultaneously thrilled and terrified me. Michael continued, "However, I want you to understand your options. You could accept the company's internal resolution, which would include Mr. Whitmore's termination, a formal apology, restoration of the accounts he reassigned, and consideration for the director position. Or you could pursue external legal action, which would likely be protracted, expensive, and emotionally draining, but which might result in significant financial compensation. The company would prefer internal resolution, obviously, but the choice is yours." Jennifer cut in, her voice gentler than I'd heard before. "Arjun, you did nothing wrong. You reported legitimate discrimination through appropriate channels. Whatever you decide, you have support." I asked for time to think about it, which they granted immediately. That weekend, I consulted with my own attorney, someone who specialized in employment discrimination and civil rights cases. Her name was Diana Foster, and she'd been recommended by a colleague's brother who'd won a substantial settlement in a similar case. Diana's office was in downtown Boston, in one of those historic buildings with creaking floors and windows that looked out over the harbor. She reviewed all my documentation, listened to the relevant portions of my recordings, read through Jennifer's investigation summary that I'd been provided. Then she looked up at me and said, "You have an excellent case. The company knows it, which is why they're moving aggressively to contain the situation. The question isn't whether you'd win. The question is what you want the outcome to be." I thought about that for a long time. What did I want? Justice, obviously. Consequences for David's behavior. But did I want money? Or did I want change? Did I want a settlement that would make me financially comfortable but allow the company to sweep this under the rug with a non-disclosure agreement? Or did I want something that would actually prevent this from happening to the next person? "I want both," I finally said. "I want compensation that reflects the professional and emotional damage this caused, but I also want structural changes that make it harder for this pattern to repeat." Diana smiled. "Then we negotiate for both. Let me make some calls." The negotiation took 6 weeks. During that time, David was placed on administrative leave, which the company announced as medical leave for personal matters. I was reassigned to report directly to the CFO temporarily, which was awkward, but at least removed the daily hostility. Kelsey filed her own formal complaint, which strengthened both our cases. 2 other employees, neither of whom I knew well, came forward during the investigation with their own stories of discriminatory treatment under David's management. The pattern was too extensive to deny. By August, we had a settlement framework. David Whitmore would be terminated for cause, forfeiting his severance package and unvested stock options. I would receive financial compensation equivalent to 3 years' salary plus damages for emotional distress. Kelsey would receive similar compensation. The company would implement mandatory bias training for all managers, would revise their promotion criteria to include explicit anti-discrimination language, would create an anonymous reporting system for discrimination complaints, and would hire a diversity and inclusion officer at the VP level. The part I insisted on, the part that Diana had to fight for hardest, was the public accountability clause. The company wanted complete confidentiality standard for these settlements. I refused. We compromised. They would issue a public statement acknowledging that discriminatory practices had occurred, that they'd taken corrective action, and that they were committed to ensuring all employees had equal opportunity for advancement, regardless of national origin, religion, or cultural background. They wouldn't name David specifically, but anyone who followed corporate announcements would be able to connect the dots. The statement went out in September, the same week the financial settlement was finalized. It was buried in a longer announcement about diversity initiatives, but it was there in writing, permanent and searchable. Several industry publications picked it up. I got calls from former colleagues who'd experienced similar treatment at other companies, thanking me for speaking up. LinkedIn messages from people I'd never met saying my case gave them courage to file their own complaints. 3 companies in our industry reached out asking me to consult on their diversity policies, offering compensation that made it clear they were taking this seriously. David Whitmore's LinkedIn profile went dark in October. No new position announced. No farewell posts from Stratford Solutions colleagues. Just silence, which in corporate America speaks louder than any accusation. The director position was posted internally in November, with revised criteria that emphasized documented performance metrics and client satisfaction scores over cultural fit and traditional background. I applied, knowing the optics were complicated, but also knowing I was the most qualified candidate by every measurable standard. The interview panel included Jennifer, the CFO, and the newly hired VP of Diversity and Inclusion, a woman named Dr. Catherine Okafor, who'd spent 15 years studying systemic discrimination in corporate environments. She asked me directly how I'd handle team members who might resent my promotion given the circumstances. I told her the truth, that I'd do the same thing I'd always done, which was deliver excellent work and treat everyone with the respect David had failed to show me. The job offer came 3 weeks later. Director of Strategic Innovation, with a salary increase that reflected both the new position and the market value someone with my settlement could command elsewhere. I accepted, not because I needed to prove anything anymore, but because I'd built something at this company, and I wasn't ready to let David's discrimination drive me away from work I genuinely loved. My first week in the new role, I sat down with every member of my team individually, including Patrick and others who'd benefited from the system that had held me back. I told them I had no interest in revenge or creating a hostile environment of my own. I told them my standards for performance were high but applied equally. I told them that discrimination of any form, against anyone, wouldn't be tolerated on my team. Most of them seemed genuinely relieved. Patrick, to his credit, apologized for not speaking up when he should have. Kelsey told me she'd been terrified to come forward until Jennifer's investigation gave her the opening to do so. Several people admitted they'd noticed the disparate treatment but hadn't known how to address it or feared retaliation if they did. The culture didn't change overnight. Systemic problems never do. But it started changing. We implemented blind resume reviews for new hires, removing names and university affiliations from initial screenings to focus on skills and experience. We revised our client relationship protocols to emphasize expertise over perceived cultural alignment. We created mentorship pairings based on complementary skill sets rather than demographic similarities. Small changes, incremental progress, the kind of work that doesn't make headlines, but that prevents the next Arjun from facing the same barriers I did. 8 months after I started as director, we landed a contract with a major international client, a tech company based in Singapore, that needed comprehensive security infrastructure redesign. The CEO specifically requested me after reading about my promotion and the circumstances around it in an industry publication. "We want to work with someone who understands that merit transcends geography and name recognition," he said on our first call. That contract was worth $3.2 million, the largest single account in company history. I structured the team carefully, making sure to include Patrick and several others who'd worked under David, demonstrating that my leadership style would judge people on their contributions, not their pedigrees. The anniversary of my first meeting with Jennifer passed quietly. I was in my office, reviewing proposals for a new security protocol, when I got an email from Diana Foster. Subject line, "Thought you'd want to see this." The attachment was a court filing from another company in our industry, a discrimination lawsuit filed by an employee named Jamal Thompson against his supervisor. The supervisor's name wasn't in the filing, but the complaint referenced hiring practices and advancement barriers that sounded hauntingly familiar. Diana's note said, "Your case set a precedent that made this possible. He knew he had a path forward because you took one first." I sat with that for a while, thinking about the cost of speaking up versus the cost of staying silent, about how my father had tried to make himself smaller and how I'd refused to do the same, about the person I might have become if I'd accepted David's suggestion to use a different name on emails. Sometimes I still wonder if fighting back was worth it. The settlement money helped, obviously. Paid off my student loans and gave me financial security I hadn't had before. But the real compensation was subtler, harder to quantify. It was being able to sign emails with my actual name without wondering if I was limiting my own opportunities. It was seeing younger employees, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds, working without the constant low-grade anxiety that maybe their name or their accent or their lunch choices were holding them back. It was knowing that the next person wouldn't have to fight the same battle alone. David Whitmore never apologized, never reached out, never acknowledged wrongdoing beyond what the settlement forced. I heard through mutual connections that he blamed me for his unemployment, claimed I'd been overly sensitive and politically motivated, said the company had capitulated to avoid bad publicity rather than because actual discrimination occurred. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit at first, the fact that he'd learned nothing and accepted no responsibility. But eventually, I realized his lack of growth wasn't my problem to solve. I'd done what I needed to do, which was refuse to let his bias define my career trajectory. What he did with the consequences of his own actions was between him and whatever version of himself he saw in the mirror. Kelsey got promoted 6 months after I did, to a newly created position focusing on client relationship analytics. We had lunch occasionally, comparing notes on how we were handling leadership roles in a company that had failed us both in different ways, but that was genuinely trying to improve. She told me she'd started documenting everything the moment she noticed disparate treatment before I'd filed my complaint, because her mother had been an employment attorney who'd taught her that memory was unreliable, but documentation was evidence. I was terrified to use it, she admitted over sushi one afternoon. Terrified of making waves, of being labeled difficult, of losing my job. Then you did it first, and I realized silence was more expensive than risk. 2 years after the settlement, I was invited to speak at a conference on workplace discrimination and legal remedies in the tech sector. The organizers wanted someone who'd actually navigated the system successfully, not just academics or attorneys. I almost declined, not because I didn't want to help, but because I wasn't sure I wanted to be defined by this experience forever. Diana convinced me to accept. "You're not defined by what happened to you," she said. "You're defined by what you did with it. There's a difference." The conference was in Chicago, a massive convention center packed with HR professionals, corporate attorneys, and employees from various industries who'd experienced discrimination. I told my story to an audience of maybe 300 people, walking them through the decision tree of documentation, reporting, investigation, negotiation. Afterward, during the Q&A session, a young woman raised her hand. She was South Asian, probably mid-20s, and when she spoke, her voice cracked with emotion she was trying to control. "My boss told me I should consider anglicizing my name on client emails. He said it would make things easier for everyone. I wanted to file a complaint, but I'm afraid I'll lose my job. How did you know when the risk was worth it?" I thought about that question for a long time before answering, aware that everyone in that room was waiting for reassurance I couldn't honestly provide. "I didn't know," I finally said. "I genuinely didn't know if speaking up would cost me everything I'd worked for. I was terrified. I'm still dealing with anxiety around authority figures that I didn't have before all this started. But what I realized was that staying silent had its own cost. It cost me sleep and dignity, and the ability to look at myself in the mirror and feel proud of who I was. You have to weigh those costs against each other and decide which price you're willing to pay. Document everything. Find an attorney. Understand your rights. But also understand that this system isn't designed for easy victories. The question isn't whether it's fair. The question is whether you can live with the alternative." The woman nodded, wiping her eyes, and I saw several others in the audience doing the same. After the panel ended, maybe 20 people came up to talk to me privately. They shared their own stories of name-based discrimination, of being told to downplay their cultural identity for professional advancement, of supervisors who praised their work ethic while questioning their leadership potential. Each story had different details, but the same underlying architecture of institutional bias disguised as helpful advice. I exchanged contact information with several of them, passed along Diana's firm details, offered to be a reference if they decided to file complaints. That evening, alone in my hotel room, I felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. This is the work, I thought. Not the dramatic courtroom victories or the substantial settlements, but the slow, grinding process of making it slightly easier for the next person to stand up. That's what justice looks like in systems that resist change. 3 years after my settlement, Stratford Solutions was recognized by several industry organizations as a leader in workplace diversity and inclusion. They'd hired 30% more employees from underrepresented backgrounds. They'd revised their entire performance evaluation system to minimize subjective bias. They'd promoted more women and people of color to director level and above than in the previous decade combined. I wish I could say that transformation was purely altruistic, that the company had experienced some moral awakening. But the truth was more complicated and more pragmatic. My case had exposed them to significant legal and reputational risk. The settlement had cost them money, yes, but the potential cost of more lawsuits and loss of clients who cared about these issues was far higher. They'd changed because change became economically necessary, not because change became morally obvious. I could live with that pragmatism as long as the outcome was the same. Fewer people subjected to what I'd experienced, fewer conversations where talented employees were asked to make themselves smaller for someone else's comfort. Last month, I got a LinkedIn message from a recruiter at a competitor company offering me a VP position with a substantial salary increase. The message was professionally written, emphasizing my track record and leadership qualities. Then, almost as an afterthought, the recruiter added, "Our CEO specifically mentioned he was impressed by your willingness to stand up for principled action, even at professional risk. We need more leaders like that." I read that line multiple times, trying to determine if it was genuine or performative, whether this company actually valued integrity, or whether they'd just recognized that discrimination lawsuits are expensive. Eventually, I decided it didn't matter. I wasn't interested in leaving Stratford, not because of loyalty to a company that had allowed discrimination under its previous leadership, but because I'd invested too much in changing its culture to walk away before that work was complete. I sent a polite decline, thanking them for the opportunity and explaining I was committed to my current role. But I saved the message in a folder I'd started keeping of evidence that speaking up hadn't destroyed my career the way David had implicitly threatened it would. The folder also contained an email from Robert Kelly, the Northridge Industries CEO, whose account David had taken from me. Robert had found out about the discrimination case through industry contacts and reached out directly to apologize for not recognizing what was happening. "I should have questioned why you were suddenly removed from our account," he wrote. I let logistics and relationship management obscure what should have been obvious, which was that I'd requested to work with you specifically for your expertise, not Patrick for his university connections. I'm embarrassed it took me this long to address this. He'd pulled Northridge's contract renewal from Patrick and requested I personally manage it going forward. The account had grown to $2.1 million annually by then, and Robert's public statement about why he was making the change sent ripples through our industry. Several other clients followed suit, specifically requesting diverse account management teams and making it clear they'd take their business elsewhere if companies couldn't demonstrate genuine commitment to inclusion. Market pressure achieved what moral arguments often couldn't, forcing companies to confront systemic bias because their clients demanded it. My father called me on the 4th anniversary of my settlement, which he'd marked in his calendar despite me never explicitly telling him the date. I saw your LinkedIn update about the industry award, he said. Director of the Year for Innovation and Inclusion. Your mother cried when I showed her. She's so proud, Beta. I'm so proud. His voice cracked on the last sentence, and I realized he was crying too, which I'd maybe witnessed 3 times in my entire life. I kept my name, Dad, I said, understanding somehow that this was what he needed to hear. I fought to keep it, and I won. There was a long silence, and when he spoke again, his voice was steadier. I wish I'd done the same. I wish I'd been braver. But I'm grateful you didn't have to wonder what would have happened if you had been. You showed me what I couldn't show myself. We talked for another hour, about his early career experiences he'd never fully shared, about the accommodations he'd made that he'd thought were necessary for survival, about how different the world looked now versus 30 years ago, even though some fundamental struggles remained the same. I hung up, feeling like I'd finally understood something about my father I'd missed my entire childhood, the weight he'd carried of making himself smaller so his children could grow up bigger. The last time I saw David Whitmore was accidental, at an industry conference about 18 months after his termination. He was working for a small consulting firm, the kind of operation that hires people who can't get positions at reputable companies anymore. He saw me across the exhibition hall, and his face went through several emotions in quick succession: recognition, anger, shame, defiance. He turned and walked in the opposite direction before I could decide whether to acknowledge him or not. I didn't feel triumph at his diminished circumstances. I didn't feel vindication or satisfaction or any of the emotions I'd imagined I might experience if we crossed paths again. Mostly, I felt sad. Sad that he'd probably learned nothing, that he'd likely blame me for his professional decline rather than examining his own behavior, that he'd carry his biases into whatever new position he managed to secure and inflict them on whatever unfortunate employees ended up under his supervision. Sad that this cycle would repeat somewhere else unless someone else had the documentation and the courage and the resources to fight back like I had. The system isn't designed to protect people like me. It's designed to protect people like David, to give them benefit of doubt, to accept their explanations about cultural fit and strategic positioning without questioning the underlying assumptions. Winning doesn't change that fundamental architecture. It just creates small cracks in the foundation, spaces where the next person might slip through and maybe widen those cracks a little further. If you're reading this and you're facing similar discrimination, I can't promise you that fighting back will be worth it. I can't promise the system will protect you, or that justice will be served, or that you won't lose things that matter in the process of defending yourself. What I can tell you is that silence has its own costs, that documentation is power, that you're probably not imagining the bias you're experiencing, and that there are attorneys and HR professionals and colleagues who will believe you if you report it properly. The choice is yours, always, and no one can tell you what the right answer is for your specific situation. But I kept my name. Arjun Mehta, Director of Strategic Innovation at Stratford Solutions, recognized industry-wide for implementing policies that make it slightly harder for the next David Whitmore to destroy someone's career for having the wrong kind of name. I kept my name, and they had to learn to work with it. That's not everything, but it's something. It's enough. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.